Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Mark Klobus, your host for the channel. Today I'm talking with Aaron Weinacht, author of the book Nikolai, Chernyshevskii, and Ayn Rand, Russian Nihilism Travels to America. Aaron, welcome to the New Books Network.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mark.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be on the show. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Uh, I'm a history professor out in Dillon, Montana, which I like it here. Lots of people, I think, would consider it punishment for some kind of sin they hadn't committed, since the county I live in is the same size as the state of Connecticut and has like 9,000 people in it. But anyway, I like it here quite a bit, and my job enabled me to finally get around to rehabbing my doctoral thesis, which was on nihilism in Russia in the 1860s and Ayn Rand. And it took me a while to get the manuscript in a shape I was happy with and get some funding to go do a little more research and so on. But I finally got there. Better late than never, I guess. So this project's been about, probably 10, 12 years in the making.
So what was it that led you to choose this as your dissertation topic? I mean, it's a fascinating one, and it was one that I thought really was so relevant, not just to intellectual history and thought, but I mean, given Ayn Rand's presence in America today, it was such a it was so fascinating to see you trace out these connections and these parallels. Why did you settle upon this as a topic?
Well, it was kind of an accident, really. I was kind of in the market for a dissertation topic. I was kind of getting to that point of my grad school studies. I went to the University of Kentucky in Lexington and studied with a couple of, I'll just give a shout out here, really fantastic graduate mentors, Karen Patron, who's a modern Russian historian, and then Dan Rowland, who's one of the small coterie of Russian medievalists and early modernists out there. And so, anyway, I was just kind of getting to the point where I needed to really be thinking about what to write my dissertation on. And I was in this graduate seminar, and I was reading some material by a Russian journalist by the name of Dmitry Pisarev, who was writing in the mostly in the 1860s, and who's one of the kind of central characters in the book, along with Nicholas Chernyshevskii. And at some point, I think when I was an undergraduate, I think I'd vaguely heard of Ayn Rand, and at some point I had picked up a copy of Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. And read it, and I don't really remember why, but I did. And anyway, so I was reading Pisarev for this class, and I don't know. At one point, he's talking about egoism and the importance of the self, and kind of the supremacy of the individual as the kind of irreducible basic unit of society and so on. And I don't know, at one point it just occurred to me, man, this kind of sounds a little bit like Ayn Rand. It was kind of an idle thought. At this point, I didn't even know Rand had been an immigrant from Russia at all. And so anyway, I just happened to walk into my doctoral thesis advisor's office one day, Karen Patron, and said, Karen, I was just reading Pisarev here, and I don't know, it sounds kind of like Ayn Rand, doesn't it? And I'll never forget, her eyes got really big, and she almost levitated out of her chair. I don't know how she pulled that off, But anyway, as academics, we get excited about the most unaccountable things. But anyway, she looked at me and said, "Have you ever read Atlas Shrugged?" Because I then kind of explained to her what seemed kind of similar about those two things, and I said, "No, I've never heard of it," And she said, "You need to go and read Atlas Shrugged, like right now." like leave my office this instant and go get yourself a copy of Atlas Shrugged. And as I was leaving her office to do my advisor's bidding, as one should in these matters, I heard her yell behind me, "I think you have your dissertation topic." And of course, I'm thinking, well, I don't know why, but I guess I'll go read the book and see what she's talking about. Well, um, Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, for those in the audience that have never read it, is better than 1,000 pages long, and I must admit, when I picked it up and started seeing what she was talking about, I may be the only person on earth who has ever read Atlas Shrugged in one sitting. I am not making that up. I was awake for like 14 straight hours and read that book, or whatever it took me, and. So anyway, that was how I ended up with this as my doctoral thesis topic, when I realized that, wow, Rand came from Russia in the early 20s to this country, and yet somehow, so in 1863, when the nihilist movement really got off the ground in its fashion with the publication of Chernyshevskii's book, What Is to Be Done, these two things are so much alike that there's got to be some connection, right? There's something here. And so that's when I started working my way backwards from Rand, trying to figure out if my, kind of hunch was right. And obviously, since I managed to get a book published about it, my conclusion was that there was something there that was interesting, although I'm sure that I haven't seen any reviews of the book yet, but presumably, this or that reviewer will, pick a hole in it where I've overdetermined the thesis or something like that. But to answer your question, that's how I got onto this topic. So it's kind of a happy accident, really.
Well, so a lot of people who are listening to this, or who will listen to this, are probably familiar with Ayn Rand and objectivism and a philosophy that has had a very large impact upon American political discourse and American thought. But Russian nihilism is a subject that might be a bit more unfamiliar. And I was wondering if you could perhaps start us off by explaining what Russian nihilism is, maybe the origins of it, how it developed in the 19th century, and how it was you think that Ayn Rand might have been exposed to it prior to coming to America.
So, whenever I suppose probably the most visible usage of the word nihilism in American culture is probably that fantastic line from The Big Lebowski, where John Goodman says, "Whoa, say what you want about National Socialism, at least it's an ethos." Kind of the literally, nihilism is belief in nothing, right? Which isn't, we all believe in something in general, so it must, have a slightly more nuanced meaning than that. So, what that speaks to is the reality that the group of people who became known as the nihilists, especially Nikolai Chernyshevskii and Dmitry Pisarev, both of whose names we've mentioned already, who are doing most of their writing that really made a splash in the 1860s, especially the early 1860s. So the name nihilist was really applied to them by their enemies. In particular, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, and then another Russian writer by the name of Ivan Turgenev, whose name is probably a little less well known in the West than Dostoevsky is. But his book Fathers and Sons, or sometimes it's translated as Fathers and Children, is pretty well known in the West. And so, from the point of view of writers like Turgenev and Dostoevsky, the reason the people they're criticizing should be dubbed nihilists is because, from their point of view, they want to tear down everything in society and culture that we hold dear. And so we dub them nihilists. probably the most famous literary character who that label nihilist was applied to would be one of the main characters in Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, whose name is Bazarov, and um, and Bazarov is kind of in a way, he's a kind of radical empiricist, or we might call him a vulgar empiricist. He spends all of his time in the book dissecting frogs and so on. And he's not so much a real scientist as he is a kind of aesthetic scientist. I suppose you might think now of the difference between science and scientism. Sometimes that word gets bandied around these days. So then in Dostoevsky's novels, in particular, he gets onto this a little bit in Crime and Punishment with the main character Raskolnikov. The literal meaning of that name being schismatic. So that kind of gives us the sense that we're kind of tearing things down a little bit. But then Dostoevsky really gets on to his main attack on the nihilists in his fiction would be in his novel, sometimes translated as Demons, sometimes translated as the Possessed, playing on that scene from the Bible where all the spirits of the demons go into the pigs and the pigs all go over the cliff. So in both cases, both in Dostoevsky and Turgenev's works, the general sense is that there's this kind of youthful army of intellectual and cultural barbarians who are busily in the process of tearing down all that we hold sacred and all that everybody else should hold sacred too. And so that's how the name nihilists gets applied to people like Chernyshevskii and Pisarev, who we can get to the substance of Chernyshevskii's novel here in a minute, but like just to give an example, three of the characters in the book appear to live together in a menage a trois, right? So we're kind of tearing down standard ways we think about marriage and so on. Or sometimes people who are followers of Chernyshevskii's, kind of purposefully flouted social conventions. Had women going around in pants and smoking cigarettes and things like that, kind of flouting conventions of the day. So. I think it's probably useful to go into the idea of or what nihilism meant in that specific context in the 1860s, because somewhat later, particularly in the 1880s, you see kind of in the Western press references to Russian nihilists. But usually what they're talking about there is actually people who were involved in the terrorist movement trying to assassinate Alexander the Third, and successfully having assassinated Alexander the Second in 1881. And so there's some relationship there in that the kind of the 1880s era of quote unquote nihilists might have said that they drew some inspiration from the earlier nihilists, but really the core of 1860s nihilism is about an emphasis on the kind of irreducibility of the self and how the self, the individual ego, is really the what we ought to care about, and the freedom of that self is what we ought to promote in society. And so, if you want to draw some radical political implications from that, like in the Russian case, we should get rid of the Tsar. You certainly can, but ultimately. Nihilism, I think, is really about a particular view of the self, and whatever political implications we want to draw from that are kind of second order consequences of some more important first order principles. So I guess where I've got to here correct me if you think I've skipped over anything that the audience might find useful, Mark. But I think that kind of leads us up to then how might Rand have been exposed to these kinds of ideas? That's kind of where we're at, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I mean, in a way, Chernyshevskii's novel "What Is to Be Done" was so ubiquitous in Russian society that, I mean, in some ways, it's you might ask a different question, which is, I mean, how could one avoid it? Because really, Chernyshevsky was everywhere. I'll give you an example. This one's kind of humorous in a dark sort of way. There are police reports apparently which indicate that I got ahead of myself there. There's a scene in What Is to Be Done where one of the main revolutionary characters, a guy by the name of Rakhmetov, who's kind of this. I cast him in the book as in a way kind of an analog to the John Galt character in Atlas Shrugged. He's kind of this traveling revolutionary agitator. There's a famous scene in Chernyshevskii's novel where he pounds all of these nails through a board really close together, and then he sleeps on the spiky end of the nails, poking through the board. And I think the general interpretation of this scene is that he's kind of preparing himself to be tortured here by the secret police if he gets caught. He's kind of toughening himself up for the revolution that lies ahead. And in police reports, actually, there's at least one recorded case that other scholars have uncovered of somebody actually doing this in real life, kind of inspired apparently by Chernyshevskii's novel. Likewise, I mentioned the infamous House of Three, as they say earlier, that happens in Chernyshevskii's novel. And if you look at the personal lives of some of the artists and intellectuals that were important to what's often called the Silver Age in Russia in the 1890s, kind of this outpouring of artistic expression and so on, you can find a couple of cases that I'm aware of artists, poets, musicians, etc., attempting such experiments, and they're reading Chernyshevsky and so on. So, in a lot of ways, Chernyshevsky's book becomes a bit of a Bible for disaffected Russian youth after its publication in 1863. Which there again, immediately makes one think of the status that books like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead and so on have among, youth in this country for whom, we have this feeling that there's something wrong in the world today, and I don't know what it is. It's the
I was thinking like maybe Catcher in the Rye or On the Road. This is a book that they adopt and try to live for a while because if it hits them at the right time, it just clicks with their outlook.
Yeah, that's one of the points I'm trying to make in the book is that it's not just that Chernyshevsky and Rand say similar things. It's that their books appeal to the same kind of people at the same kind of stage in life. There's, I'm certainly no psychologist or anything like that, but I do point to a little bit of just kind of pretty basic developmental psych research in the book that suggests that there's a certain stage in life at which these kinds of theses really appeal, and so what I'm trying to do in the book then is chart out a logical course by which Rand could have come in contact with the kinds of ideas Chernyshevsky is laying out in What Is to Be Done, and also Pisarev's writings, which were pretty widely popular. Hey, have you read the most recent article Pisarev wrote? Kind of environment, and so. You've got the very much or sorry, I'm being incoherent here. The very high importance of Chernyshevskii's writings to people writing in the Silver Age and so on. And so the argument I'm really making in the book is that that Chernyshevskii's name and the nihilist legacy never really goes away uh, after the 1860s are over. There was an assassination attempt on Alexander II in 1866, a guy by the name of Dmitry Karakazov, and there was quite a bit of clampdown after that, and censorship and so on. I should mention, by the way, that Chernyshevskii actually wrote his novel while he was in prison. Which is maybe notable because we think about clampdowns and Russian censorship and so on. So the fact that Chernyshevskii got permission to write that novel while he was in prison has got to be one of the most spectacular errors of censorship in the history of censorship. In fact, it's actually even better. He was writing it and he sent it to his editor. Of the journal that he had generally published most of his work in, the Contemporary it was called, a guy by the name of Nekrasov, who apparently came to the prison and picked up the manuscript, and then Nekrasov actually lost it in a cab on the way apparently back to the editorial office, and believe it or not, the manuscript was eventually returned to him by the Russian police. So the Russian police organs of various kinds are directly responsible for the publication of one of the most subversive novels ever written in history, which is an irony to say the least. And so anyway, then. Rand is a kid in the early 20th century, and so one answer that's part of this very long answer to your question is that in a lot of ways Chernyshevskii is just so ubiquitous that you could read ideas that he had and even not even know that he was one of the people who kind of started talking about a radical individualism that rejects social convention and so on. He's just kind of in the air, and I have yet to run across I suppose we might call it the smoking gun. I've been through Rand's papers. Rand was notably reticent to acknowledge intellectual debts. And frankly, though, it'd be kind of surprising if she did admit any kind of debt to Chernyshevskii, especially because the Bolsheviks like to claim the nihilists as kind of one of their own precursors. And so because of Rand's, obvious anti-communism and so on, I think in hindsight, it'd be kind of surprising if she had, acknowledged such a debt. So in a way, I'm kind of arguing uphill here in that in the face of resolute silence about most of her influences on the Russian side of the house, I'm trying to make an argument here that, acknowledged or not, that influence is there. So I think that's kind of how I'm arguing that that this set of ideas emerging in the 1860s really get carried forward into Rand's thought, which she then brings to the United States, and and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, Atlas Shrugged is a novel that is has a large enough cultural footprint that a lot of people are familiar with it, even without having read it. But Chernyshevskii's What Is to Be Done is a novel that most of our listeners probably are not as familiar with. I was wondering if you could briefly sketch out the novel, the plot, and the key characters before we talk a bit more about the parallels between that and Rand's most famous work.
Yeah, we can do that. The subtitle to Chernyshevskii's novel is it's called Tales About the New People, and what Chernyshevskii is playing off of with that title is the idea in circulation among cultural and political dissidents in the really from the 1840s on, as the movement gets more self-focused rather than outright political agitation as its main goal. Um, his idea is that what we need in society is a new kind of person, or that once we've kind of burnt down these stuffy old institutions of traditional society and culture, this is going to make way for a new kind of person to emerge. And so, really, then his what is to be done is, as the subtitle suggests, just a story about this new kind of person who's going to emerge, albeit some new kinds of people who are kind of on the leading edge of this new movement. But it's interesting to note that Chernyshevskii makes a real point. Clear through the book of continually reminding the reader that these new people he's talking about are really not unique at all. That the future is just going to take the fact that this is the way people are for granted. In a way, the character Akhmedov is really the only. In Chernyshevsky's definition of usual and unusual, he's really the only unusual character in there, as the author wants to portray them. So anyway, basically what happens is the three main characters the book revolves around, two men and one woman, Kirsanov, Lopukhov, and Vera Pavlovna are the name of the three characters. And Vera Pavlovna is a part of a real phenomenon. It's sometimes called fictitious marriage, where basically what she does is she gets married in order to escape a kind of oppressive family scenario, or at least she sees it as oppressive. And so two of the characters get married, and all three of them are in medicine, or in training to be in medicine of some kind. And so here you've got a kind of backhanded reference to the importance of not so much of science, but of the idea of science. So. It's basically, the book just follows the lives of these three characters, and some kind of high points of this following of their lives is Vera Pavlovna. And I just realized that I can't remember which of the two guys she's married to first, which is really bad. But anyway. She realizes that they're not really in love with each other anymore, but that she is in love with the other one. And so that's how this House of Three business gets started, as Chernyshevskii pretty clearly suggests that the solution to the problem of this love triangle is for them to say, well, let's have an 1860s version of polyamory, and. So that's kind of one of the high points. And at one point, what the guy she's married to first, actually, she won't kind of take the plunge, so he actually fakes his own death to kind of get himself out of the way, so that she can shack up with the other guy. And then another one of the real high points, in some ways, I think anyway, kind of the high point of the book, is. Vera Pavlovna starts this dress shop, which eventually she decides to run on what amounts to kind of communal principles, like kind of employee-owned, equal profit sharing, and so on. And here's where the British utopian socialist Robert Owen is important, and that Chernyshevskii very much kind of has, Owen's various enterprises in mind. For those who haven't heard of Owen, he turned a lot of the management of his factories in England over to his employees, and he's the one who, made that attempt at a kind of communal living experiment here in the United States. It's called New Harmony, Indiana, and that's still a town in Indiana. In fact, I actually grew up not too far from there mostly. But anyway, so what happens then is over the course of the book, Vera Pavlovna's dress shop, kind of communal business enterprise, sort of metastasizes. It becomes it works so well that the fact that it works well starts to affect the society around it, kind of in these irresistible ways. Here, Chernyshevskii probably has a bit in mind something like the French utopian socialist Charles Fourier's idea of the phalanstery, where once we build one of these kind of utopian socialist communes, the logic of it will become kind of invincible and will spread all over the world. And so Chernyshevskii's novel isn't just about the lives of these characters as they kind of discover the importance of a quote unquote scientific worldview and start throwing off social conventions as they see it that don't match up with that. But it's also a story about revolution. And Chernyshevskii has to leave the revolution out, possibly because he was writing it while he was in prison, and even if the censors were not too bright and let him publish it, it's hard to imagine that they'd miss where he actually describes the revolution. But then, we might be a little more critical and say, well, part of why he leaves it out is because he doesn't know how it's going to work. But, I leave that if anybody wants to tackle Chernyshevskii, you can decide which of those scenarios is more likely. But anyway, so then in the last part of the novel, Vera Pavlovna has this big vision. And in it, she's seeing the future, this future in which we're living in these kind of communes, a la Owen and Fourier, a little bit, and all of this has ultimately gone back to her decision that what she really wanted to do was start a dress shop on these kind of communal principles because she wants to, because that's kind of her individual passion, is to do something like that. So this is maybe the right time to mention where a thesis like mine in this book is swimming a little bit upstream here, in that no doubt at least a few listeners, and maybe you as well, Mark, are wondering, so it sounds like Chernyshevskii's writing a utopian socialist novel, so what the heck does that have to do with a radical individualist like Ayn Rand? And so my argument, in a way, I'm kind of reinterpreting what Chernyshevskii was really after in that book. He's often been, in hindsight, kind of wedded to the origins of the Russian Revolution and so on. That novel often gets kind of co-opted into that, kind of long story, to the extent that we could put the revolution down to, being the product of people with ideas. But the argument I'm trying to make here is that what nihilism was really about was the freedom of the individual, and that to the extent that people exercising that freedom results in some kind of socialist revolution, that's kind of a second order consequence of more important first order principles. And so that's where, to the extent that I'm trying to nuance what people have already said about Chernyshevskii, that might be where I could be accused of, being a little bit of a heretic in terms of the, interpretive history of that book. So that's a bit of an overview, I think, of what Chernyshevskii is up to in that novel.
I was thinking it definitely is heretical, given what you described on the surface with utopian socialism of the early 19th century, and how that seems to be diametrically at odds with a group of people for whom socialism nowadays is an epithet. But when you go into your book, and the bulk of your book is a comparison between the two books, and it's a comparison that you don't go about chapter by chapter, but what you do instead is you go about it in terms of key themes, and we're not just talking about the fact that the themes are like literary themes. You're talking about the ideological themes, and it's the kind of thing that I thought was very interesting, not just from the standpoint of Ayn Rand's writings and objectivism, but also about how we sometimes misinterpret or assume incorrectly things about socialism that the socialists themselves didn't necessarily believe. They were not talking about the Orwellian collectivist state where everybody is a drone, where the vision that people like Chernyshevskii and the nihilists were talking about was one in which the individual was not going to be crushed in a totalitarian state, but instead become supreme. And that's where, and as you draw out those themes in your chapters, that becomes very. That's when I started to recognize those parallels you were describing. I was wondering if we could start by going into those parallels now, starting with your examination of egotism or egoism as it existed in the two books.
Yeah, both characters are really defining egoism as the principal. Sorry, I think I said characters. I meant Chernyshevskii and Rand and Pisarev as well. They're defining egoism as the right way to look at the individual person. They're saying that ultimately, what it means to live a good life and to let other people live their good lives too is for the individual to reign supreme, and that there's very little. There's little, if any, scenario in which we can say that one person is obligated to sacrifice for somebody else. Now, a person, could in fact sacrifice for someone else, but Chernyshevskii and Pisarev and then later Rand, when you read them carefully, it's inescapable, the sense that if personal sacrifice on behalf of someone else is gonna be necessary, it's gonna be a pretty rare case. Kind of an unusual or spectacular case, and so they're not talking about the 1860s crowd. They're not talking about this in a vacuum. The German, I suppose we could call him an anarchist in a way. The German anarchist Max Stirner wrote a book in the 1840s called "The Ego and Its Own," in which he kind of lays out the absolute primacy of the individual as the kind of intellectual groundwork for an argument for anarchism, and so on. So Chernyshevskii and Pisarev aren't the only people, of course, who are talking about egoism, but they do it in a Russian context that's fairly unique. So I should probably speak to that for a minute. So. I mentioned earlier the Turgenev novel "Fathers and Sons," and what that novel's title references is there were a whole generation of revolutionaries that came out of the 1840s. In particular, probably the three most important names that come out of that would be Vissarion Belinsky, Alexander Herzen, and then Michael Bakunin, who later became kind of a globe-trotting anarchist and feuded with Marx at the second meetings of the Second Communist International and so on. But anyway, what Turgenev was doing in that novel was laying out this kind of generational difference in among the ranks of the Russian dissidents. So there's the 1840s generation, and they just got dubbed the men of the 40s. as the 1860s radicals got later dubbed the men of the 60s, the Shestidesiatniki. So the dissidents of the 1840s, say, we'll take as just a test example, somebody like Alexander Herzen, who eventually emigrated to England and did most of his journalism from there and so on. They're really outward focused. They want to reform or burn down and insert a new Russian state. So for a and in the 1840s, the context in which they were doing that was during the reign of the Tsar Nicholas I, who, especially after 1848, created this extremely oppressive environment for intellectuals. Just to give a kind of humorous example, under Nicholas I, they actually censored ellipses from physics textbooks. And, if you know anything about the history of astronomy, ellipses hadn't been controversial since Kepler. So they're thinking about what's wrong in Russian society is very much outwardly focused, a kind of, revolutionary thought as you might expect it to occur. We have this kind of political system. We should have a different one. Here's what that should look like, and so on. But there was a brief honeymoon kind of period between the dissidents and the state when Nicholas's successor, Alexander II, emancipated the serfs in 1861. So when Alexander II took the throne, he signaled, pretty clearly that he had a pretty major reform program in mind, and it took a while to get that off the ground. But for the intellectuals, the real kind of culminating moment was the emancipation of the Russian serfs. And so there was this period where dissident intellectuals could maybe think to themselves, well, maybe it's possible with the right prompting or with the right people in charge, with the right philosopher king in charge, to see a reform, to see us heading towards the kind of society we want to have. But then, as you might expect, the honeymoon period wore off pretty quickly. And so what happened was, this next generation of Russian dissidents have come to be called the men of the 60s. They don't have a lot of outlet for their dissident ideas. They don't. In a way, they're kind of pessimists in that earlier dissidents, even going back to the Decembrist revolt in 1825, where there was an attempted coup, an attempt to put in probably some kind of constitutional monarchy. They don't. They're shifting their focus. Their focus shifts away from what kind of political system should we have to what kind of person should the new people of Chernyshevskii's subtitle be, and their answer to that question is to be ultra focused on the self, to see in the egoist self as being the kind of unit of society, and that everything that we're wondering whether that's a good thing or a bad thing gets judged on the basis of the self. And so that to take Chernyshevskii's novel as an example, Vera Pavlovna's character in there makes it quite clear that it's not like she's starting out to build this socialist commune. The reason this socialist commune is good is because that's what she wanted to do. That's ultimately what makes it good. And so the commune that emerges is very much kind of symbolizes Vera Pavlovna's. Imagine the word I in capital in a capital letter with quotation marks around it. That communal enterprise becomes kind of the sign to the universe of her I, of her ego. See this thing here? Vera Pavlovna did that. And if you've read Atlas Shrugged, for instance, or for that matter, The Fountainhead, you see that same basic idea come out quite clearly. Of course, in the case of The Fountainhead, it's Howard Roark's, architectural creations, which he then, blows up rather than, let someone else have them. And in the case of Atlas Shrugged, there's this scene where the steel tycoon character in there, his name is Hank Reardon, he's kind of standing up on this hill looking down at his big steel making enterprise. And he kind of has this little mental dialogue with himself where he says, I'm if this isn't an exact quote, it's pretty close. He says that he wished that his sign out in front of his mill, instead of saying Reardon Metal, could instead say Reardon Life. And so the idea of that is that this, a bit like Vera Pavlovna's dress shop, that Reardon's industrial steel enterprise kind of serves as his shout of his I exist to the universe. So, and there's a couple of examples from the some of the sources in the book of this very close focus on egoism and how that kind of serves as the absolutely unshakable first principle from which everything else in the books kind of follows.
And that's something that you then pick up and elaborate upon when you start talking about the heroes of the two novels and how they embody that notion of it and the idea of people and federation. And this is something where a lot of people sometimes draw the analogy with Nietzsche's writings, and Nietzsche does get a mention in your book, but these ideas that you're talking about, Chernyshevskii writing, before Nietzsche is, and he the idea is that the development of heroism in his book, the heroes that he advances as these individuals, are very much ones that prefigure Rand's concept of them in Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly the idea of the heroic is very much a kind of central principle of both books. And it's interesting. It's funny because not only is the idea of the heroic central, but also the idea that we think that these characters are heroic, but really in the future we won't see them that way because everybody will be like them. So in a funny sense, they're also kind of unheroic. That's also quite a common theme in both books. So. Probably the most obviously capital H heroic character in What Is to Be Done is the revolutionary character Rakhmetov, and literary scholars have had kind of a time figuring out how Rakhmetov kind of fits in that novel. Now, we shouldn't put too much on that because, of course, Chernyshevskii could have written a less than perfect book, right? From a literary point of view, right? So, it's not as though a character not fitting, is somehow this like big interpretive mystery that we have to explain, right? Anyway, but the characters in the book, they do really exemplify this kind of heroic vanguard sort of ethos. Rakhmetov certainly does, and what's notable, I think, is that in both books, the heroes rarely, if ever, kind of question their course of action in life. And so in both cases, I think there's the conviction that the heroic thing to do is also the simple and obvious thing to do. There's for books that take such a kind of moral and moralistic, if you want to be more critical, stance on the world, there's surprisingly little actual moral reflection in them, in the sense of thinking that there's a real mystery to be solved here. Chernyshevskii and Rand both take this quite forceful approach to the right ethical answer to your dilemma, and well, if you're too stupid to see that that's the right answer, well, that's just so much for you. And they really, and so there again, it's not just what I'm trying to emphasize here is that it's not just what they say, it's how they say it, or it's the tone with which they say it, or the kind of aesthetic with which they describe what happens. So, like. So where, for instance, on the heroic side of things, three characters in Chernyshevskii's novel, kind of defy social convention and live in this house of three, and so on, and where the characters in Atlas Shrugged kind of wake up and realize that what they really need to do is to quit supporting this society that's exploiting them. Thus, the title of the book. At the same time, both authors kind of give you this glimpse of what the opposite of that kind of heroism is, and they do so, in quite similar terms. Like there's a scene in What Is to Be Done where it's the last mention of Vera Pavlovna's parents, who own this pawnbroking business. And so that's not an accident that's what they do, right? Because they're not actually creating anything. There is the implication. They're just kind of living off the creation of others, which of course is one of the central themes of Atlas Shrugged. And Chernyshevskii, he basically writes what amounts to an obituary for Vera Pavlovna's parents, even though technically they're still alive. And basically, so this book is a tale about the new people. And in so many words, he said, these are the old people, the previous people, and they no longer matter and irrelevant. So off they go. And so they're kind of, in a way, non-people now. And you see the same thing in Atlas Shrugged. The character in there who is kind of an analog for J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Stadler is his name. He gets effectively nuked by his own creation, and then they're probably the most. At least to my mind, what's to be the most poignant example of this is a scene where one of the main characters, John Galt, gets captured and he's being tortured. And one of the other main several of the other main characters kind of organize this rescue effort and they get him out. And one of the main female character, Dagny Taggart, at one point in the process of getting Galt out, shoots a prison guard. And she says, and here again, if this isn't the exact quote, it's pretty close. She says that she squeezed the trigger with no more remorse than she would have as if she had fired at an animal. And so, you get the sense then that these heroic characters who are pursuing their passion in life, these are the future, and this is what the future looks like. And the people who can't see that, they become in effect non-people, and that's really that kind of theme I think is important to both books, and so. You can see that come out in a lot of ways in one of Rand's followers in this country, a novelist by the name of Terry Goodkind. There's a picture of one of his novel covers in my book. Wait a minute, did I? Yeah, that is in the book, and it has these, very heroic-looking, kind of statuesque characters on the cover. For anybody who's listening, if you just look up Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series and look at his novel covers, you'll see what I'm talking about. And there again in those novels, the people who don't fit the heroic bill become non-people in the end. So it's really a kind of a common emphasis on heroism there, both in what they say and how they say it.
Hmm. So you have and yeah, it's a heroism that is kind of tied to a lot of things that we kind of that we associate with a period of perfection. I was thinking here where you're talking about youth and the celebration of youth that you again see in both uh, uh, Chernyshevskii's book and in Rand's book as well.
Yeah, both of them, as we kind of alluded to earlier. I mean, part of the way to compare these kinds of books is to ask to whom they appeal, and lots and lots of people will say, "Oh, I went through a Rand phase in my high school days or my college days or whatever." That's a pretty common story, and I've said some similar things about who Chernyshevskii appealed to. You had boarding school students hiding copies of Chernyshevskii under their pillow and things like that. So I've seems to me, and I'm prepared to hear arguments to the contrary here, but at least in Rand's case, I think a lot of the emphasis on the importance of youth goes back to her sense that the promise of youth was wasted in Bolshevik Russia. That it probably comes across most forcefully in Rand's novel We the Living, which is kind of a semi-autobiographical take on growing up in Bolshevik Russia and so on, and very much the idea in there comes across that the dreams, the aspirations of youth, they rise and then they kind of get stomped down by the leather jacketed commissar types, and in Chernyshevskii, there again, you very much get the sense that he's kind of written off the older generation. As I kind of alluded to a minute ago, that it's the younger generation that's going to have to carry the torch for a new and better way of seeing the importance of the individual, and that in doing that, they're going to kind of have to put those. Those older people, those former people aside. So it's very much a kind of brash, youth focused set of ideas, both in the sense that youth is seen as the hope for the future, and the older generation had better get on board or get out of the way. But also that both of these books, then, as you might expect, appeal quite strongly to the younger generation. I mean, I'm sure we'd all like to pick up and read a book in which we discover that people just like me are going to be the salvation of the universe. I mean, I suppose, I don't know, maybe confirmation bias is an overly critical way of putting that point, but yeah, they really do see youth as a key, as where this revolution, whatever it's going to look like, it's going to be the youth who spearheaded.
Now, you talk in the novel about in your book about another parallel in the two novels, and that is the man-God problem. I was wondering if you could briefly explain what that is and how we see it in both works.
So it's been argued with regard to the kind of utopian socialist era. It seems like there's a guy named Jonathan Beecher who proposed this in context of writing a book about Charles Fourier, that one of the first things you have to do if you want to be a kind of radical socialist is find a way to get rid of the problem of original sin. And that that leads us into the kind of the heritage of Christianity, which proposes that man became God in order to redeem that stain of original sin and all the ones that we've committed following on that original one. And so. In particularly, say, in the writings of Dostoevsky, for whom Christianity and the heritage of Christianity, and of course or the Orthodox branch of Christianity specifically, the person of Christ and Christ's coming on earth and so on is really central to his whole worldview. And so as writers like Chernyshevskii are doing everything they can to turn that on its head, what they end up doing is proposing a reversal of the idea that God became man, and instead they're saying man will become God in this new future. Each person kind of his own individual God, and so there's a scene in What Is to Be Done that seems suspiciously like Rachmaninoff is preparing for crucifixion, right? So here's a clear reference to the idea of man becoming God here, and I should mention that there was a whole movement in kind of late 19th and very early 20th century Russia, which the Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov was involved in. That was called God-manhood. In fact, one of Solovyov's, some of his writings have been translated into English under the title Lectures on God-manhood. This was something he thought about quite a bit. And then again in Rand, her characters, particularly just focus on John Galt here for time's sake. He gets kind of transfigured in his fashion. I brought up the torture scene earlier. He's strapped to some sort of infernal machine. I'm trying to think, what does Rand call it? It's the Ferris Persuader, I think it's called, named after its inventor, and he's strapped on there in a position as though he's being crucified, right? So with his legs together and down and his arms out and so on. And so you could immediately say, wait a minute, Aaron, that sounds an awful lot like sacrifice, and I thought we weren't doing that, right? But Galt is quite his behavior on the cross, so to speak, is quite a bit different than in the historical accounts of Jesus Christ's crucifixion, where he's laughing at the people that are attempting to torture him. There's this very comical scene, actually, where in the middle of them torturing him, the machine breaks down and he tells them how to fix it. And it's... Rand isn't famous for her sense of humor, or at least I don't think she's is, but that really is kind of a funny scene there. And so his whole attitude is, you could argue it's a little bit like Jesus saying, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." But at the same time, the overwhelming sense you get from it is that all of the people around him are kind of so many ants that really just don't matter in Galt's world, and they don't matter so much that he doesn't even have to pay attention when they're actually torturing him. So here's kind of a vision from Rand's end of the individual man kind of becoming God, and there again. Chernyshevskii and Rand aren't, they're not pulling this stuff out of whole cloth. I mean, in the book, I discuss the influence on Chernyshevskii of the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, where he talks a bit about how in the future he thinks man will become God. And, Stirner, who I brought up earlier, seems to write in that direction too. So, you can follow these ideas as far back as you want, I suppose. But either way, there's a very clear sense in both sets of writings in the Nihilists in the 1860s and then in Rand's later on that the concept of God is kind of an insult to man, and that what we should really be doing is replacing what we formerly thought of as God with this new kind of heroic egoist individual.
Now, you have all these you've identified all these parallels in terms of the big ideas, and it can be easy in one sense to say, well, these ideas, because to go back to something you were saying earlier, are so self-evident. It's perfectly natural that you would find a lot of people coming to those same conclusions. But in your final chapter, you talk about which I thought was really interesting. You move away from the notion of big ideas, and you talk about how in both novels the way that relationships and love and sex are used are strikingly parallel. How they're seen as ways of codifying the themes of the book. It's as though the way that Chernyshevskii does it in his book so impressed Rand that she ends up, having that similar approach with her characters in her most famous novel.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate portrayal of what I'm after. I think both of them, in a way, they're trying to show in practice how a series of relationships works if you start out with the right ideas versus if you start out with the wrong ideas. And so, for in both cases, what's really, really important is the notion that you got to start out with the right ideas. Rand's famous refrain was "check your premises." So they, in a way, both Chernyshevskii and Rand are kind of sketching out a sort of life is logic proof existence where your future turns out well or not well, depending on the logicality or not of the syllogism by which you live, and so the way relationships tend to work then, and in Chernyshevskii and Rand's novels both really reflects that. So, for instance, when Vera Pavlovna and her husband are still kind of in denial that actually they're not really all that much in love with each other, it just doesn't work, and they don't get along very well. We might say there's it's not that they dislike each other, it's just that there's really no spark. Whereas then when Vera Pavlovna finally ends up with the person that she should end up with, there's plenty of spark. Now, I mean, that's not depicted in a particularly explicit fashion, although for the standards of the 1860s it certainly was, which is why the novel was in a lot of ways seen as such a scandalous affair. But there's this great scene where Chernyshevskii kind of wryly has the two of them laying in bed together, and they're discussing life, the universe, and everything, as Douglas Adams said, and I'm going to try and come up with the line here where Vera Pavlovna says something about calculating your advantage and seeing what's the best thing for you to do, what's the most advantageous for you as an individual, and you can tell that sex is about to happen because the guy who's in bed with her says, and you know what, he was calculating exactly that, his own advantage. It's a very funny way of saying, okay, yeah, and then sex happened. So it seems kind of stilted, and of course, in a way, it is. I mean, people don't normally say this kind of thing in the moment. but Chernyshevskii sees every aspect of life as being kind of freighted with either bad or good philosophical principles that are going to make those aspects of life turn out well or poorly, as the case may be. And so even sex is. Which we might think of as, perhaps the most instinctive of human activities, I suppose. Even sex is philosophically freighted, and it's important to it to get it right. And Rand, of course, does very much the same thing. Probably the most well known. Um, Area where Rand, or instance where Rand deals with sex pretty explicitly, is what kind of appears to be a rape scene, actually, in the Fountainhead. And then there's something kind of similar in Atlas Shrugged as well. And at some level, I kind of have to admit defeat on how Rand thinks about sex. I've never really managed to wrap my head around how she thinks people will find sex as she describes it fulfilling. But at the very least, she's doing what the same thing Chernyshevskii is doing, which is imbuing sex with this egoist character. And that really stands out for its uniqueness because, of course, if you want to imbue sex with a kind of philosophical character, it would seem like you would end up not with an ultra individualist view of it, but with kind of if I could put it this way, an ultra communitarian view of it. I mean, there are in fact two people here, but. But Rand and Chernyshevskii both they want to try and reconcile sex with the idea of egoism or radical individualism, and so I think it's less important to try to figure out how they thought sex would actually work and be fulfilling with that kind of principle than it is to observe that both of them end up with what seemed to me like a set of the same problems with trying to do that, right? So, maybe they have a rational way of trying to square what looks to me like a circle, but, we don't actually have to answer that to observe that, it's an interesting parallel to note that they seem to start off with similar principles and they end up with similar problems, which just kind of reinforces the idea that they're really trying to do the same thing here.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've taken up a lot of your time, but before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
Well, I got a couple of ideas. I seem to have this affinity for writing about cranky libertarians, and there's one of the best, actually, American cranky libertarians is this guy by the name of Albert J. Nock. I don't know if you've heard of him or not, but there's really nothing been done on him, and he's kind of a fascinating character. He wrote this book called Our Enemy, the State, back in the 19th century, or early 20th, I think. This project is very much in the kind of in the conceptual stages at this point. There's really nothing much that's been done on Nock, and he's kind of a fascinating character. Just kind of an inherent interest, inherently interesting character, I think. And then another project I kind of have in mind is I've done some work before on the sociological theorist Philip Rieff, and I'd like to do some more on that because so one of the things I find kind of fascinating about the historical writing in general or historiography is that theoretically it seems like it's kind of reached a bit of an impasse since the this is probably going to get me in trouble with somebody, but I'll just call them the postmodernism debates back in the in the 80s and 90s and so on. And that was something I was pretty interested in graduate school, and I've kind of long wondered if if there might not be a way out of that impasse, I think basically everybody just quit talking about it because they were too tired to keep going. And at least that's, maybe you have a different opinion, but that's my impression of how those debates over objectivity and subjectivity and so on, how those kind of, they didn't so much conclude as they kind of petered out. And Reef has long kind of fascinated me as a sort of writer who might actually offer a way out of that. Probably not a way that's going to be palatable to lots of people, but at least a way out of that. And so I've kind of like to do some more work on Reef as well. So that's a couple of projects I kind of have in mind for the near future here.
Well, they both sound pretty fascinating, and if they result in a book, I hope we can have you back on the show to talk about them.
Well, I'll give you a shout if they do so. So thanks for having me, Mark.
Well, thanks for agreeing to be on the show. Have a wonderful day.
I will. You do the same.